The ballroom was perfect. The flowers, the cake, the 31 chairs, the 31 people who promised they'd come. By 7:15, every chair was still empty. Grace Holloway had spent 15 years making other people's celebrations unforgettable. Tonight, she sat alone in her wheelchair, one hand on her pregnant belly, and wondered if she had ever mattered to anyone at all. She was still wondering when the doors opened, and Damien Moretti walked in. Grace Holloway had worked inside the St. Moritz Hotel for 14 years, 8 months, and if you asked her on a tired evening, approximately 11 days, too long to count anymore. She had started at 28 pushing a housekeeping cart through marble corridors on the overnight shift, learning which guests wanted extra towels left without knocking, and which ones needed a quiet word about the coffee machine before 7 in the morning. She was good at the invisible details, the kind of good that nobody notices until something goes wrong. Over 14 years, Grace had covered more shifts than anyone on staff. She had sat with a new receptionist who cried in a linen closet during her first week. She had shared her lunch with kitchen workers who forgot theirs. She had stayed 3 hours past her shift to help a banquet team finish a setup when 2 people called in sick on New Year's Eve. She did these things without being asked. She did them without expecting anything in return. That was simply who Grace Holloway was. Then, 6 years ago, everything changed. She had been walking home from the hotel at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, covering a shift for a colleague whose child was sick, when a car ran a red light on West 57th and hit her at full speed. She survived. Her spine did not recover completely. Grace spent 4 months in rehabilitation, learning to navigate a world that had been built for people who could stand. Her fiancé, Marcus, stayed for 6 weeks. Then he left a note on the kitchen counter that said he wasn't strong enough for this, and she never heard from him again. The medical bills arrived the same week Marcus left. Grace paid them, slowly, over years, working through pain that she had learned to describe as manageable, because the alternative, admitting how much it actually cost her to complete a full shift, would have meant losing the only stable thing remaining in her life. She never became bitter. That was the part nobody could quite understand. She had every reason. The accident, Marcus, the debt, the daily indignity of navigating a workplace not designed for her chair, with colleagues who forgot she existed until they needed something covered. She had every reason, and she never used a single one. Anger is heavy, she told the hotel's new head of housekeeping once, during a conversation neither of them had planned. I can't afford to carry anything heavy. Birthdays were the only days that cracked the surface, not because of what they were, because of what they revealed. The precise measurement of how many people actually thought about you when nothing was required of them. For 5 years, Grace had spent her birthday alone in her apartment with takeout food and a grocery store cupcake, telling herself it didn't matter. This year, she decided it did matter. She spent 4 months saving, overtime shifts on weekends, skipped lunches. The physiotherapy appointment she quietly postponed for 2 months because the money needed to go somewhere else first. She reserved the hotel's smaller ballroom. Her ballroom, the one she had cleaned and set and broken down 1,000 times over 14 years, and she decorated it herself over 3 evenings after her shift ended. Rose gold balloons, fresh flowers she ordered wholesale, handwritten thank you cards at every place setting, one for each of the 31 people she had invited. She wrote every card by hand. It took her 2 evenings and most of her feeling in her right hand. She didn't mind. Every single person confirmed they were coming. Housekeeping colleagues, banquet staff, receptionists, the 2 chefs who always saved her a plate on late nights, the security manager who had helped her navigate the service elevator when her chair's wheel jammed 3 winters ago, 31 people whose shifts she had covered, whose lunches she had paid for, whose bad days she had quietly absorbed for nearly 15 years, 31 people who said yes. The first message arrived at 6:40. Grace, so sorry. Something came up with my kids. By 6:50, 4 more had followed. By 7, the messages had become a rhythm, arriving in clusters, each one a small, clean impact, like drops of water finding the same bruise. Emergency, flight delay, family obligation, not feeling well. Next year for sure. Not one of them called. By 7:15, Grace Holloway sat alone in a ballroom that could seat 80 people. beside a 3-tier cake she had spent $300 on, surrounded by 31 empty chairs and 31 handwritten cards that nobody was coming to read. The Manhattan skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her. The chandeliers burned their $15,000 light over absolutely nothing. Grace pressed one hand gently against her pregnant belly. 7 months along, in fact, she had not yet told most of her co-workers, because she hadn't wanted it to be the reason people came. And with the other hand, she covered her mouth. She was not going to cry in this ballroom. She had cleaned this ballroom. She had given this ballroom 14 years. She was not going to cry in it. Maybe, she whispered to no one, I was never important to anyone. The words sat in the empty room for exactly 3 seconds. Then the ballroom doors opened. Grace looked up. The man standing in the entrance was not someone she recognized, but every member of hotel staff within eyeline went immediately, instinctively still. He was not supposed to be in this part of the hotel. The St. Maya, Moritz's private ballroom on the 41st floor, had been booked for a different purpose tonight. A closed-door meeting between men whose names did not appear on public calendars, arranged through channels that the hotel's general manager had been quietly compensated not to ask questions about. Damian Moretti had arrived at 7 on the hour, the way he arrived everywhere, ahead of schedule without announcement, with the particular stillness of a man who had learned long ago that the person who controls the pace of a room controls everything else inside it. He had been told the ballroom was prepared. What he had not been told was that the floor's secondary ballroom, 30 feet down the corridor, contained a woman sitting alone beside an enormous untouched birthday cake, crying in a way that was clearly costing her a great deal of effort to keep quiet. He had heard it through the wall, not sobbing, barely a sound at all, just a particular quality of silence that exists around someone who is working very hard to hold something together in a room where they believe no one can see them. Damian Moretti had grown up with that sound. He knew exactly what it was. He stepped away from his security team without explanation and walked 30 feet down the corridor and pushed open the ballroom doors. And Grace Holloway looked up from her birthday cake, tears on her face, hand on her stomach, 31 empty chairs behind her. And the most feared man in New York City looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked toward her. She spent 4 months saving for this night. Overtime shifts, skipped lunches, a physiotherapy appointment quietly postponed so the money could go somewhere else. She handwrote 31 thank you cards, one for every person she had ever helped. Every single one confirmed they were coming. By 7:15, not one chair was filled. Grace Holloway had spent 15 years making every other person's celebration perfect. Tonight she sat alone in her wheelchair, one hand on her pregnant belly, wiping tears she was trying very hard not to shed. She didn't know that the most feared man in New York City had just walked through the hotel entrance. She didn't know he had seen everything, and she had absolutely no idea what he was about to do next. Follow now, because what happens next is something nobody saw coming. Drop a comment. What would you have done if you were Grace tonight? The 41st floor knew he was coming before he stepped out of the elevator. That was always how it worked with Damian Moretti. Not because anyone announced him, his people didn't announce him, that was the point, but because a particular quality of alertness moved through a room ahead of him, passed from person to person like a current, and by the time he actually appeared, everyone was already standing slightly straighter and looking slightly elsewhere. The elevator doors opened at 7:03. Damian stepped out, and the corridor reorganized itself around him without a word being spoken. He was dressed the way he was always dressed for these evenings. Light gray suit, 3 buttons, the kind of tailoring that cost more than most people's monthly rent and was worth every dollar because it moved with him rather than on him. His burgundy tie was precisely knotted. His dark hair was swept back. At his collar, where the shirt's top button remained open, the edge of a tattoo was visible, the kind that suggested the rest of it told a story. His suit was not inviting you to ask about. He walked without hurry. 2 men flanked him at a distance of exactly 4 feet, close enough to respond, far enough not to crowd. 3 more followed. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The St. Moritz's general manager, a thin man named Hargrove who had managed this floor for 9 years and prided himself on his composure, met them at the corridor junction and lost approximately half that composure in the first 4 seconds. Mr. Moretti. A practiced smile. Everything is prepared. The ballroom is. Damien wasn't looking at him. He had stopped. Down the corridor, 30 feet away, the secondary ballroom's doors were partially open. The light inside was warm, chandeliers, candles, the golden excess of a room dressed for celebration. Through the gap in the doors, visible in the slice of light, a 3-tier cake sat on a table surrounded by empty chairs. Dozens of empty chairs. Damien looked at the chairs for a moment. Then he looked at the woman beside the cake. She had her back mostly to the door. Pink dress, dark hair, wheelchair, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other resting against her stomach. And even from 30 feet away, even through a partially open door, the particular stillness of her shoulders told him everything he needed to know about what she was doing and how hard she was working, not to let anyone see her do it. He stood in the corridor and watched for 3 seconds. Then he turned to Hargrove. "Who is she?" Hargrove blinked, looked at the door, back at Damien. His composure rearranged itself into something cautious. That's Grace, sir. Grace Holloway. She's our head of housekeeping. 14 years with the hotel." A pause, the kind that precedes information the speaker isn't sure they should share. Tonight is her birthday. She reserved that ballroom herself, saved for it for months, apparently. Another pause. Her guests didn't arrive. None of them. She invited 31 people. Hargrove's voice had gone carefully neutral. "We've had no arrivals." Damien looked back at the open door. The cake. The empty chairs. The handwritten cards at every place saying that nobody was sitting down to read. Something moved through him that he didn't immediately name and didn't try to. He was 11 years old. The first time he understood what his mother's birthday meant to her. She had worked the overnight housekeeping shift at a hotel in the Bronx. Smaller than this one. Older, the kind of place where the carpet in the corridors was always slightly damp. She cleaned rooms from 11 at night until 7 in the morning and came home smelling like industrial cleaner and something floral that was supposed to cover it. On her 42nd birthday, she had set the kitchen table with a plastic tablecloth and 2 plates and told Damien she had invited a few people from work. He remembered watching her check her phone, the way her expression changed each time she looked at it. A small, practiced adjustment. The particular discipline of someone who had learned to absorb disappointment without allowing it to show on their face. Nobody came. She ate birthday cake with her 11-year-old son at a plastic tablecloth kitchen table and told him it didn't matter, and he was young enough then to almost believe her. He had thought about that kitchen table more times than he would ever admit to anyone. Mr. Moretti. Luca, his head of security, had appeared at his shoulder. "The partners are waiting. Calloway's people flew in from Chicago." Damien said nothing. He watched Grace reach up and wipe her face with the back of her hand in one quick, efficient movement. The gesture of someone who had decided they were done crying and was now simply informing their face of that decision. She straightened in her wheelchair, adjusted the position of a fork at the empty place setting beside her, picked up one of the handwritten cards, set it back down. "Cancel the meeting," Damien said. The corridor went very quiet. Luca absorbed this for 1 second. "Sir, Calloway's partners have been arbicate." Damien's voice was even. "Tomorrow, next week, whenever they're available." "They flew in from Chicago," Luca said carefully. "Then they can fly back." He turned from the door and looked at Luca directly for the first time since stepping off the elevator. "Business waits. Humanity doesn't." From somewhere inside the meeting room down the corridor, a raised voice began forming an objection. Damien was no longer listening. He turned back toward the secondary ballroom, straightened the single button on his jacket with 2 fingers, and walked toward the open doors. Grace heard the footsteps and assumed she was in trouble. That was the reasonable assumption. This ballroom had been reserved for someone else tonight. She had known that when she booked the adjacent room, had specifically confirmed with the events coordinator that the 2 spaces were separately managed. But sounds carried on this floor and the corridor outside had gone strangely quiet in the last few minutes, and now someone was walking through her ballroom doors with the particular purposefulness of a person who owned whatever room they entered. She turned her wheelchair to face them, and then she went very still. She recognized him the way anyone in Manhattan's hospitality industry recognized Damien Moretti, not from personal experience, but from the specific quality of attention that gathered around him, the way hotel management moved and the way his security team didn't. She had seen him twice before in 14 years, both times from a service corridor, both times from a distance that felt appropriate and safe. He was considerably closer now. She straightened in her chair on instinct, folded her hands in her lap, prepared, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 14 years being professionally invisible, to apologize for whatever was about to be required of her. He stopped at the edge of her table. For a moment, he simply looked at the room, the empty chairs, the untouched cake, the 31 handwritten cards at 31 place settings where 31 people had not arrived. His expression didn't change. He looked at it the way he might look at a set of figures that confirmed something he had already calculated. Then he pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. Grace opened her mouth, closed it. He wasn't looking at her with the expression of a man about to ask her to leave. He was looking at the birthday cake with the focused, considering attention of someone deciding something. A woman, he said quietly, who spent years creating celebrations for strangers. He turned and looked at her directly for the first time. Shouldn't have to celebrate alone. Grace said nothing. She was physically incapable of saying anything. Damien turned to Luca, who had appeared in the doorway with the careful expression of a man professionally committed to not reacting to anything. "Get the kitchen," Damien said. "Full dinner service, whatever they have." He looked around the room. "The flowers near the east wall need replacing. Find out what she ordered and double it. The musicians that were booked for this floor tonight, wherever they went, bring them back." A pause. No photographers. No one documents this. Anyone with a phone near those doors goes elsewhere. Luca nodded once and stepped back into the corridor. Grace watched this happen. "You don't have to," she started. "I know," Damien said simply. What followed was, in Grace Holloway's 14 years at the St. Laugh, Moritz, the most efficiently executed event transformation she had ever witnessed, and she had witnessed several hundred. Within 8 minutes, the candles at every table setting had been relit. Within 12, a string quartet that had been packing up on the floor below was reassembling near the windows. Within 15, the kitchen had confirmed a full dinner service and the first course was already being prepared. Not the standard banquet menu, but something the head chef had apparently decided on his own initiative warranted proper attention. Fresh roses replaced the arrangements that had begun to droop near the east wall. The tablecloths were smoothed. The handwritten cards at the empty settings were carefully, quietly collected. Not discarded, just removed from sight, which Grace noticed and understood and was grateful for. Hotel staff appeared at the edges of the room in ones and twos, drawn by whatever traveled through this building's walls when something unusual was happening. They stood near the service doorways and the corridor entrance and watched without speaking. Grace recognized most of their faces. Some of them looked at the empty chairs and then looked at the floor. Damien did none of this with performance. He issued instructions in a low, direct voice, and then sat beside Grace and said nothing, which was somehow the most startling part of the entire sequence. The city's most feared man sat beside a hotel maid's birthday cake in a silent ballroom and simply waited, with the patient stillness of someone who had decided to be present and meant it completely. The musicians began, something slow and warm that filled the room from the windows inward. Damien picked up the cake knife. "You should be the one to cut it," Grace said. Her voice came out unsteady. "We'll do it together," he said. "But first," he looked at her, "make a wish." Grace looked at the candles, 42 of them, burning steadily in the draft from the barely open windows, casting small, repeated shadows across the white frosting. She had not made a birthday wish in 6 years. The year of the accident, she had wished for things that didn't come. And after that, the ritual had felt like a conversation with someone who had stopped answering. She looked at the candles for a long moment. Then she pressed one hand briefly against her stomach. The small, habitual gesture she made without thinking now, the way you touch something you are trying to protect. And she closed her eyes. She didn't wish for anything specific. She just sat in a room with music and candles, and one unexpected act of human decency, and she let herself feel it without immediately preparing for it to end. She blew out the candles. The quartet paused for a moment, then shifted into something celebratory, and from the doorways and corridor the watching staff began, tentatively at first, and then with more conviction, to applaud. Damien reached into the interior pocket of his jacket. He set a small wrapped box on the table in front of her. White paper. No ribbon. The kind of wrapping that had been done quickly by someone who didn't have a gift bag available and hadn't bothered to pretend otherwise. You didn't have to bring anything, Grace said. I didn't know I was coming, he said. Open it. She unwrapped it carefully, the same careful attention she gave everything, and lifted the lid of the small box inside. A silver bracelet. Simple chain. A small rectangular plate engraved in clean, even lettering. She tilted it toward the candlelight and read it. You were never invisible. Grace Holloway had spent 6 years learning to hold things together in public. Through the accident and the rehabilitation and Marcus leaving and the debt and the daily negotiation of a world that had not been built with her in mind. Through all of it, she had maintained a composure that her colleagues had occasionally mistaken for toughness and was actually something considerably more fragile and more hard-won than that. The bracelet sat in her palm. 4 words. She had held together through worse than 4 words. She didn't hold together now. The dinner service ran until 9:30. The quartet played through 3 sets. The kitchen sent out 5 courses that nobody had ordered from any menu. The head chef had apparently decided this warranted improvisation, and the results suggested he had been waiting for an occasion that deserved his actual attention. Damian ate sparingly, the way he always did at events where eating wasn't the point. Grace ate with the careful appreciation of someone who understood that food prepared with genuine effort deserved genuine attention. They didn't talk much during the meal. That was fine. Damian had learned long ago that the quality of a silence told you more about a person than most conversations did. Grace's silence was comfortable and self-contained. Not the silence of someone waiting to be noticed, but of someone who had spent enough time alone to have made a kind of peace with their own company. It was the silence of a person who expected nothing and had therefore developed the capacity to simply be present in whatever was actually happening. He found it unexpectedly restful. At 9:40, the quartet finished their final set and began packing up. The kitchen staff cleared the last course. The room settled into the quieter rhythm of an evening winding down. Candles burning lower, the Manhattan skyline deepening outside the windows. Damian didn't leave. He wasn't entirely sure why. He had a car waiting, 3 rescheduled calls that his assistant had already flagged as urgent. The Chicago partners were somewhere in this hotel, almost certainly unhappy, which was a situation that typically resolved itself but occasionally required management. He stayed. Tell me about yourself, he said. Grace looked at him with the expression of someone who has misheard something ordinary and is deciding whether to ask for clarification. I'm sorry? You've worked here 14 years, he said. The manager told me you're the most loyal employee in the building. I'm asking what that means, what the 14 years look like. Grace was quiet for a moment. Nobody's ever asked me that, she said. I'm aware. She looked at her hands, then at the bracelet, which she had put on immediately, and kept glancing at with the quick private attention of someone checking that something real is still there. Then she talked. She had grown up in Queens, the younger of 2 daughters. Her parents had died within 18 months of each other. Her father first, heart attack at 61. Her mother following with the particular efficiency of someone who had decided there was no longer sufficient reason to stay. Grace was 24. Her sister had moved to Portland. Grace had stayed in New York because she didn't know what else to do with herself, and staying felt like the only form of loyalty still available to her. She had taken the hotel job as a temporary measure and remained for reasons that accumulated gradually. Stability, familiarity, the specific comfort of a routine that asked the same things of her every day and could therefore be relied upon. She had met Marcus at 31. He was good for 3 years, and then the accident happened and he was good for 6 weeks after that, which turned out to be the precise duration of his actual commitment. She talked about the accident the way people talk about weather events, factually, with the measured distance of someone who has processed the same information many times and arrived at a version they can deliver without it costing too much. The car, the intersection, the particular quality of the impact that she didn't remember, but had been described to her afterward by the paramedics and retained with the unwanted clarity of information received during shock. She talked about the rehabilitation, the debt, the wheelchair adjustment period, which was what the hospital called it, and which bore approximately no relationship to what it actually involved. She talked about coming back to the hotel, how the work had saved her, in the practical sense. She needed income. The hotel provided it, but also in a way she hadn't expected and still found difficult to articulate. The rooms needed making. The guests needed their morning coffee timing respected. The linen needed folding to a specific standard. The world had contracted to a wheelchair's navigable radius and expanded again through the reliable geometry of tasks that could be completed and verified and repeated. She had found that enough to build on. Damien listened without interrupting. Across the room, Luca stood near the service doorway with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had spent 11 years in close proximity to Damien Moretti and was currently observing something he had not previously observed and was choosing not to draw attention to. His employer's jaw was set. His eyes hadn't moved from Grace's face in 20 minutes, and there was something in the quality of his attention, not professional assessment, not strategic calculation, that Luca would later describe to no one, because there was no one he could describe it to as simply human. They appeared at the doorway in 2s and 3s, beginning around 9:15. Housekeeping colleagues. A waiter Grace had covered for twice in the last month. The receptionist whose shift Grace had stayed late to finish when her child's school called. They came with the particular body language of people who had seen something online and were now navigating the specific discomfort of having been on the wrong side of it. The videos had spread quickly. Someone in the corridor had ignored Damien's no photography instruction, or perhaps the instruction hadn't reached them in time, and 30 seconds of footage existed now. Damien Moretti sitting beside a crying hotel maid, reading a bracelet inscription over her shoulder. His expression unguarded in a way that the internet had decided was significant. The comments had been running for 2 hours. The colleagues arrived with apologies of varying quality. Some were genuine. Some were the performance of genuineness. Grace received them all with the same expression, open, warm, without any visible architecture of resentment underneath. She forgave each of them, completely, immediately, without qualification or condition. Damien watched this happen 3 times before he spoke. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly, when the third colleague had retreated with visible relief. Grace looked at him. "I know. They abandoned you. They did." She considered the bracelet again. "And tomorrow I'll see them in the corridor, and we'll all need to be able to work together without it sitting between us like something unfinished." She paused. "Holding anger only gives pain another place to live. I don't have room for it." Damien said nothing. He repeated the sentence internally in the way he repeated things that reorganized something without his permission. Holding anger only gives pain another place to live. He had built 11 years of professional architecture on the structural opposite of that principle. Anger, in his world, was inventory. Grievances were assets. The memory of every slight and betrayal and broken agreement was a resource to be maintained and deployed at the appropriate moment. He looked at Grace Holloway, who had lost her parents and her fiancé and the use of her legs and an entire birthday, and was currently forgiving the people responsible for the last item on that list without being asked, and felt something shift in his chest that he had no immediate category for. He excused himself at 10:15. In the corridor, he found Luca and spoke quietly for 90 seconds. "I want everything," he said. "Medical history, debt records, employment file, insurance claims, apartment, finances, everything outstanding." He paused. "Not because I'm investigating her, because I want to know what needs to be fixed and in what order." Luca nodded. "Timeline. Tomorrow morning." He went back inside and said goodnight to Grace, who thanked him with the straightforward sincerity of someone who had not yet learned to make gratitude complicated. He rode the elevator down alone. His phone buzzed at 10:40. Luca's analyst. Faster than expected. Initial findings attached. "You should read this tonight." Damien opened the file in the back of his car. He read for 4 minutes without moving. Then he closed the phone and looked out at the city for a long time. What Grace Holloway was quietly carrying, alone, without complaint, without anyone in that hotel having apparently noticed or asked, was considerably worse than he had expected. She lost her parents. She lost the man who promised to stay. She lost the ability to walk. And then, on the one night she asked for something in return for 15 years of giving, she lost that too. And still, she forgave every single person who didn't show up, without being asked, without conditions, without anger. Damien Moretti had built an empire on the principle that betrayal was never forgotten. And one quiet sentence from a hotel mate, dismantled 11 years of that belief in a single moment. Holding anger only gives pain another place to live. But what he read in that file, what Grace had been quietly carrying alone for 6 years without telling a single person, that was something else entirely. Save this story. Chapter 5 changes everything. And comment below, did Grace's forgiveness surprise you, or did you see it coming from the beginning? The file was 11 pages. Damien read it twice. Once that night in the car, once the following morning at his desk before anyone else arrived. The second reading was slower, more deliberate. The kind of reading you do when the first pass has already told you what you're dealing with, and the second is about making sure you haven't misread something. Because the alternative is that the situation is exactly as bad as it appears. It was exactly as bad as it appeared. Grace Holloway carried $214,000 in outstanding medical debt. The majority was from the initial hospitalization and spinal surgery following the accident. The remainder accumulated across 6 years of follow-up care, specialist consultations, and the ongoing physical therapy she attended twice weekly at a clinic in Midtown that charged on a sliding scale and still cost more than she could comfortably absorb. Her insurance at the time of the accident had covered 60%. The remaining 40% had been hers. She had been paying it down in monthly installments of $350, the maximum she could manage after rent, utilities, food, and the out-of-pocket costs of maintaining a life that required equipment and modifications that healthy bodies didn't. At that rate, Damien's analyst had noted with the flat precision of someone simply reporting mathematics, she would finish paying the debt in approximately 51 years. Grace Holloway was 42 years old. Her wheelchair, the one she used for 14-hour shifts across marble floors and service corridors and banquet setups, was 7 years old. The model had been discontinued. Replacement parts were sourced second-hand from a supplier in New Jersey that she had apparently found through an online forum for people managing mobility equipment on limited incomes. She had declined, twice, referrals to a newer adaptive model because the cost differential exceeded what she could justify. 3 years ago, a spinal specialist at Columbia had recommended a rehabilitation program, intensive, residential, 12 weeks, that had demonstrated measurable improvement in patients with injury profiles similar to hers. The program cost $48,000. Insurance covered none of it, classifying it as elective. Grace had attended the consultation, asked detailed questions, taken the informational packet home, and then not pursued it further. The analyst's note at the bottom of that section was 3 words. She couldn't afford it. Damien set the file down, picked it up again and turned to the last page. The analyst had flagged an anomaly in Grace's banking records. The standing monthly transfer, automatic, $120, to an organization called the Bright Mobility Fund, a non-profit that provided adaptive equipment to disabled children from low-income families, $120 every month, from a woman who was paying down a 51-year debt and sourcing her own wheelchair parts from a second-hand supplier in New Jersey. Damien sat with that for a while. He made 4 calls before 8 in the morning. The first was to a financial services contact who handled transactions that required discretion. The second was to Columbia University Medical Center's billing department, routed through a legitimate business intermediary. The third was to Grace's landlord, a building management company in Washington Heights, identified from the file, regarding a prepayment arrangement for the remainder of the year. The fourth was to a rehabilitation facility in Connecticut, the best in the Northeast for spinal injury recovery programs, whose director owed Damien a conversation he had been avoiding for 2 years. The director took the call. None of these calls mentioned Grace's name until the arrangements were confirmed. None of the arrangements mentioned Damien's. Grace discovered the first payment on a Tuesday. She was reviewing her medical account online, the ritual she performed monthly with the focused dread of someone checking a wound, when the balance appeared as 0. She refreshed the page, checked the account number, called the billing department, who confirmed that the outstanding balance had been settled in full by an anonymous third-party payment made through a legitimate financial intermediary 4 business days earlier. She sat in her apartment for a long time after that call. She called her landlord the following day about an unrelated question and learned, in the course of that conversation, that her rent had been prepaid through December. She didn't sleep well for 3 nights. She asked everyone she could think of, her sister in Portland, who was baffled, a cousin she hadn't spoken to in 2 years, the hotel's HR department, in case some employee assistance program existed that she hadn't known about. Nobody knew anything. On the fourth day, she called the rehabilitation facility in Connecticut, which had sent her a letter confirming an enrollment appointment that she had not scheduled, and the administrator told her that her program costs had been covered in full by a private donor who had requested anonymity. Grace sat in the hospital parking lot after that call for 40 minutes. Then she called the St. Davy Moritz and asked to leave a message for Damien Moretti. He came to the hotel 3 days later. They sat in the same ballroom, different configuration. Daytime. The chandeliers turned low and the Manhattan skyline gray with October cloud. Grace had her hands in her lap and the expression of someone who has rehearsed a conversation and is no longer confident in the rehearsal. "It was you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Damien said. Grace looked at him for a long moment. "The debt, the rent, the program in Connecticut." "Yes." She exhaled slowly. "Why would someone like you help someone like me?" Damien considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because someone should have done it years ago," he said. "And no one did. And that's a failure that belonged to everyone around you. And since none of them were apparently going to correct it," he paused, "I decided to." Grace pressed her lips together. "I donate to the Bright Mobility Fund," she said quietly. "Every month. I know what it costs to. I know what it means when someone just handles something, without being asked, without needing." She stopped. "I know," he said. She looked at the bracelet on her wrist. "I don't know how to accept this," she said. "You don't have to know how," Damien said. "You just have to go to Connecticut." The enrollment appointment was the following Monday. The program director was a specialist named Dr. Reeves, who had the efficient warmth of someone who had delivered both good and difficult news enough times to know the difference between false hope and genuine possibility. She reviewed Grace's imaging, her surgical history, the 6 years of documented physical therapy. She asked Grace questions for 40 minutes. Then she set down her pen and looked across the desk. "I want to be careful with my language here," Dr. Reeves said, "because I don't make promises about outcomes. But your injury profile and your documented recovery trajectory over 6 years," she paused, choosing the next words with visible care, "suggest that with the right intensive program, there may be more possible for you than anyone has told you." Grace sat very still. "What does more possible mean?" she asked. Dr. Reeves looked at her directly. "It means," she said, "that I think we should find out." The first thing Grace recovered was her mornings. Not walking. Dr. Reeves had been careful about that, had used the word possible with the precision of someone who understood the distance between possible and certain and refused to collapse it prematurely. But mornings, the specific tyranny of the first hour after waking, which had been for 6 years the most demanding negotiation of Grace's day, the pain assessment, the transfer, the series of small, effortful tasks that healthy bodies completed without thought, and that Grace had learned to approach with the methodical patience of someone disarming something. 6 weeks into the Connecticut program, the mornings changed. Not dramatically, not in the way that made for compelling television, just incrementally, measurably, in the language of degrees and duration that Dr. Reeves tracked on charts and Grace tracked in the private accounting of her own body. They became less effortful, less long, less costly. She called it, in the group sessions that were part of the program, getting time back. The other participants understood exactly what she meant. She was at the facility for 11 weeks. Damien visited twice, once at week 4, once at week 8. Both times he arrived without announcement, stayed for 2 hours, and asked questions about the program with the focused attention of someone who had decided to understand something properly rather than superficially. He brought nothing either time, which Grace found she preferred, to flowers or fruit baskets, or the performance of generosity that required reciprocal gratitude. He just came and sat and asked how it was going. She told him honestly, which was something she had started doing without quite deciding to. By week 11, her upper body strength had improved significantly. Her pain levels, tracked daily, reported weekly, had reduced to a degree that Dr. Reeves described in her notes as meaningful and sustained. She had recovered range of motion in her left side that 2 previous specialists had suggested was unlikely to return. She would not walk out of the facility, but she rolled out of it differently than she had rolled in. with a posture that had nothing to do with the wheelchair and everything to do with something that had been gradually restored over 11 weeks of being taken seriously by people who knew what they were doing. She returned to the St. Moritz on a Wednesday morning in March. The corridor outside housekeeping looked exactly the same. Grace looked at it for a moment from the elevator doorway. Then she went to work. Damien announced the foundation on a Thursday in April. He did it without theater. A press statement. A website. A brief appearance at a Midtown event space where he stood at a podium in his grey suit and spoke for 7 minutes to a room of journalists who had come expecting something related to his business interests and were visibly recalibrating as he talked. The Forgotten Hands Foundation. Its mission, as stated in the founding documents, was the support of workers in the hospitality, caregiving, and service industries who had experienced life-altering injuries, disabilities, or medical crises, and who had, as a consequence, fallen through the gaps between what their employers owed them and what the healthcare system provided. It would fund rehabilitation programs, adaptive equipment, debt relief for medical costs incurred in the line of work, legal support for workers navigating insurance disputes, transitional housing for those who had lost income during recovery. It would not, the founding documents specified, require recipients to demonstrate anything other than need. A reporter in the third row asked Damien why. He looked at her with the expression he used when a question deserved a direct answer. Power means nothing, he said, if it cannot protect people who have none. The room was quiet for a moment. The statement ran in 14 publications by the following morning. Grace had written her own job description for the ambassador role on a single page, submitted it to Damien's office without ceremony, and received back a one-line response. This is exactly right. Start whenever you're ready. She started the following Monday. What she discovered, and what surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have, was that the thing she was best at was simply being present with people who had stopped expecting anyone to show up. She visited rehabilitation facilities. She attended hearings for workers disputing insurance denials. She sat across from hotel maids and kitchen staff, and hospital orderlies and caregivers, people whose bodies had been changed by the work they did or the accidents that found them, and she listened with the full, unhurried attention of someone who understood from the inside what it meant to be heard by a person who wasn't going anywhere. She didn't give speeches in those rooms. She asked questions. The speeches came later, at the public events, and they were good because they weren't written by anyone else and didn't sound like they were. Applications to the foundation reached 4,000 in the first 6 weeks. By the end of the third month, the waiting list required a dedicated team to manage, and 3 additional funding partners had approached Damien's office asking to contribute. A profile in a national magazine ran under the headline, "The Maid Who Changed the Most Feared Man in New York." Grace read it twice, found it approximately 60% accurate, and sent Damien a text that said, "They spelled your name wrong in the second paragraph." He responded, "I noticed." It was, she thought, the most comfortable exchange she had ever had with someone she had met while crying alone beside an untouched birthday cake. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday in September. Cream paper, her name in careful handwriting. No written address. Inside was a single card, simple, no printed design, just a line of text and a time and an address. "You are invited to celebrate." Grace read it 3 times. She set it on her kitchen table and looked at it for a long while. The address was the St. Moritz, the ballroom on the 41st floor. She sat in her apartment that evening and looked at the invitation and felt moving through her chest with the quiet insistence of something she couldn't argue with, the precise sensation she had felt 1 year ago, when 31 confirmations had arrived in her inbox one after another. Hope. Fragile, specific, and completely unreasonable given the available evidence. She told herself she wasn't going. She knew, by the time she went to bed, that she was. She almost didn't go in. She sat in the car outside the St. Moritz for 4 minutes. She knew it was 4 minutes because she watched the clock on her phone with the focused attention of someone using numbers to manage something that numbers couldn't actually help with. And she looked at the hotel entrance and thought about the last time she had approached these doors with hope arranged carefully inside her chest, like something she was carrying on behalf of someone else. She thought about 31 empty chairs. She thought about the specific quality of silence that existed in a room full of tables set for people who weren't coming. The driver, a Foundation car, arranged without her asking, which she had learned was simply how Damien's people operated, waited without speaking. He had the particular patience of someone who had been told there was no rush and meant it. Grace looked at the entrance for 4 minutes. Then she put her phone in her bag and said, "Okay." Hargrove met her at the lobby entrance, the same hotel manager who had stood in the corridor 1 year ago, explaining to the city's most feared man that the hotel's most loyal maid was celebrating her birthday alone. He looked, Grace thought, like a person who had spent a year thinking about that conversation. "Ms. Holloway," he said. His voice had the quality of someone attempting professionalism over something more complicated. "Welcome." He walked with her to the elevator without further speech. The 41st floor. The corridor was quiet. The same marble, tilliarding, the same geography she had navigated 1,000 times with a housekeeping cart, knowing every scuff on the baseboard and every chandelier that ran 2 degrees warmer than the others. The ballroom doors were closed. Grace stopped in front of them. Hargrove stood to one side, hands clasped, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man removing himself from a moment that didn't belong to him. Grace put one hand on the door. She breathed in. She thought, if it's empty, that's all right. You've survived empty rooms before. You know what to do with them. She pushed the door open. The sound arrived before anything else. Not music, not applause. Just the particular acoustic quality of a large room containing a very large number of people who are all simultaneously completely silent. And then the doors were fully open and Grace was in the entrance, and every one of those people turned toward her at once. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Then someone in the front started it, and it spread backward through the room like a wave finding the shore. "Happy birthday, Grace." Not shouted, said by hundreds of people, together, with the uneven, beautiful quality of something unrehearsed, voices overlapping and finding each other and becoming, briefly, one sound. Grace gripped the wheels of her chair and stopped moving entirely. She looked at the room. Not celebrities, not business partners, not the carefully curated guest lists of powerful people performing attendance at each other's events. She saw Maria from the 3rd floor rehabilitation unit in Connecticut, who had arrived 7 weeks into Grace's program unable to lift her left arm above her shoulder, and had left 11 weeks later with her daughter's phone number written on her palm because she had finally called her. She saw the kitchen worker from the St. Moritz, Jorge, who had brought Grace soup twice during her first week back from Connecticut without explaining why, which was its own kind of explanation. She saw a man in a motorized wheelchair near the windows, whom she recognized from a Foundation visit to a workers' advocacy clinic in the Bronx, where he had sat in the back row for the first hour without speaking, and then asked a question that made the entire room go quiet because it was the precise question nobody else had been willing to ask first. She saw children, Foundation families, caregivers who had applied for assistance and received it and written letters afterward that the Foundation's coordinator had forwarded to Grace because she had thought Grace should read them, and Grace had read everyone. She saw hotel staff, housekeeping, kitchen, front desk, the overnight security team standing near the east wall with the particular posture of people who had been in this room 1 year ago on the wrong side of something and had spent 12 months figuring out how to be in it differently. She saw Luca standing near the doorway in his usual position, with the expression he always wore, carefully neutral, professionally removed, except that his eyes were doing something his face had apparently decided not to. Grace pressed one hand over her mouth. It didn't help. Damien came through the crowd the way he moved through every room, without hurry, without performance, people making space without being asked. He was carrying something small. He stopped beside her chair and looked at her for a moment without speaking, in the way he had learned was sometimes more useful than words, and then he held out the gift. A frame, simple wood. Under glass, centered and mounted, was a cream envelope, slightly worn at the corners, the handwriting on the front familiar in the way that your own handwriting always is when you encounter it unexpectedly. Her name, her handwriting. The original birthday invitation she had addressed to herself 1 year ago to confirm the booking. Below the mounted envelope, on a small engraved plate at the bottom of the frame, 8 words in clean, even lettering. The people who deserve love the most often expect it the least. Grace looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at him. "You kept it," she said. "Hargrove found it in the event files," Damien said. "I thought you should have it." Grace nodded slowly. She was doing the thing she had learned to do, breathing through it, staying present, not retreating into the composed distance she had spent 6 years perfecting. She let herself feel it. All of it. The empty room 1 year ago. The 31 cards nobody came to read. The bracelet. Connecticut. The mornings that got easier. The files Damien had read at 10:40 on a Tuesday night and acted on before 8 the next morning without telling her or asking for anything in return. 4,000 applications. Waiting lists. A woman in the Bronx who had her left arm back. A man in a motorized wheelchair who had asked the question nobody else would. Maria, who had her daughter's phone number written on her palm. All of it had started in an empty room on the 41st floor, with a birthday cake and 31 empty chairs and one decision by one unexpected person to simply sit down and stay. Someone brought the cake. 3 tiers, white frosting roses along the edges. And this time when it arrived, the candles were already lit, and the room was already full, and the pianist from the floor below was already playing. And nobody needed to be asked to gather because everyone was already there. Grace looked at the candles. 43 this year. The room waited. She had been asked to say a few words. Foundation stuff, 2 weeks ago, tentatively, with the qualifier that it was entirely optional. She had said she would think about it. She had thought about it for 2 weeks and written nothing down because she had discovered in 11 months of foundation work that the things worth saying were rarely improved by being written down first. She turned to face the room. "Being paralyzed," she said, "was never the hardest part of my life. The room was very quiet. Being forgotten was." She looked at the crowd, at the faces she knew and the faces she was still learning, and the children sitting cross-legged near the front who were looking at her with a direct, uncomplicated attention that children gave to things they had decided were important. I spent a long time believing that was simply the shape of my life, that some people were the kind of people things happened for, and some people were the kind of people who made those things happen for others, and that those were 2 different categories and you didn't move between them. She paused. One person proved me wrong. One person who had absolutely no reason to sit down at an empty birthday table and did it anyway. Proof that the category you're in has nothing to do with what you deserve and everything to do with whether someone is paying attention. She looked at Damien. Briefly, he was looking at the middle distance with the expression he used when he was listening most carefully. "Compassion is stronger than fear," Grace said. "Loyalty is stronger than reputation. And one person willing to care, genuinely, without an audience, without expecting anything back, can walk into an empty room and make it into something that changes thousands of lives." She turned back to the cake. The candles burned steadily in the warm ballroom air, casting their small, repeated light across the frosting, across the gathered faces, across the framed invitation on the table beside her that said what it said and meant every word. Grace Holloway closed her eyes. She did not wish for anything specific. She was already, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, exactly where she wanted to be. She blew out the candles. The room erupted. Applause, voices, the pianist launching into something joyful that had no business being as moving as it was. The children near the front clapped with the full-body enthusiasm of people who hadn't yet learned to be restrained about good things. Luca, near the doorway, looked at the ceiling briefly. Damien Moretti, the most feared man in New York City, stood in a ballroom full of caregivers and disabled workers and foundation families and hotel staff, and he put his hands together, and he clapped. Not for the empire, not for the reputation, not for any of the things the world had spent 11 years measuring him by. For Grace Holloway, who had spent 15 years making other people's celebrations unforgettable, and had finally, at 43, been given one of her own. 1 year ago, Grace sat alone beside an untouched birthday cake in a silent ballroom and whispered to no one. Maybe I was never important to anyone. Tonight, hundreds of people stood in that same room. Disabled workers whose lives were transformed. Children who learned that kindness is a kind of courage. Caregivers who finally felt seen. All of them there for one reason, because one unexpected man sat down at an empty table and decided that her life mattered. Grace didn't need a miracle. She needed one person paying attention. If this story reminded you that kindness is still the most powerful thing in the world, like it, save it, and share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Comment below with the moment that hit you hardest, because the next story is already coming, and it starts exactly the same way, with one person nobody expected changing everything.